good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to our weekly review of how religion impacts humanity. This week's headlines. 13 US service members, at least 60 Afghans, 2 British were killed in Kabul airport bombings. In fact, the news coming in from Kabul is increasingly horrifying, and I devote quite a length of time during this report to it. Jehovah's Witnesses are jailed as extremists for preaching their religion in Russia. Yogi Adityanath supporter talks of raping dead Muslim women in yet another hate speech. An Archbishop is sanctioned for a pedophile cover-up. Sex abuse vicar David Beater has been protected by the church for decades. Bleeding for Jesus is a book that tells the story of a QC who pitilessly abused young men. My husband refused a divorce for 9 years, a poor Jewish woman chained in a marriage. Back to Afghanistan. The Sandhurst sisterhood are trying to save Afghans. 13 US service members and dozens of Afghans were killed, and scores more wounded on Thursday when 2 explosions rocked an area outside Kabul's airport. The Islamic State terror group claimed responsibility for the martyrdom attack that involved 2 suicide bombers who detonated explosive belts at the airport's gate. At least 95 Afghans were killed and more than 100 wounded in the blasts, according to Associated Press. The explosions came as thousands gathered in a desperate effort to flee after the Taliban's takeover of the country, and just hours after the United States and its allies had warned of a potential terror attack at the airport. See this video.
It was every soldier and Marine in Kabul's worst fear, an attack where they're most exposed. As troops were patting down an evacuee at a Kabul airport gate, searching for a bomb, he or she, that's still unclear, detonated one, killing at least 13 U.S. service members, injuring more than a dozen.
This is close-up work. The breath of the person you are searching is upon you. While we have Overwatch in place, we still have to touch the clothes of the person that's coming in. Ultimately, Americans have got to be in danger to do these searches. There's really no other way to do it.
Dozens of Afghans were killed. Another bomb exploded a few hundred yards from the first as ISIS fighters sprayed gunfire. Afghans tumbled, dead and injured, into a sewage ditch. We drove through this exact spot a few days ago, a corridor flanked by concrete blast walls that leads right to an airport gate. The U.S. is relying on the Taliban to pre-screen the crowds pushing to get into the airport, hoping for a flight out of Afghanistan, patting them down before they're checked again by U.S. troops. Today, this staggeringly new and bizarre security cooperation broke down.
Clearly, if they were able to get up to the Marines at the screening, at the entry point of the base, there's a failure somewhere. It was a failure by, Taliban operate with varying degrees of competence. Some of those guys are very scrupulously good, some of them are not.
Just a few weeks ago, the U.S. was bombing the Taliban. But when U.S. troops pulled out, triggering the collapse of the Afghan army, now there's no one left but the Taliban to protect American forces as they leave. ISIS-K, an ISIS offshoot, claimed responsibility. Many of their fighters and other extremists, including al-Qaeda members, were in Afghan jails. But when U.S.-backed Afghan forces melted away, the prisoners escaped, and for the past few weeks have been on the loose. They have one clear target, the Kabul airport, where nearly all the Americans in Afghanistan are gathered and are still gathering until they leave.
The situation is one of chaos. There's people rushing to the airport to get out of the country. Desperate people are clinging to planes as they take off. Panic among the population about how they might be treated by the Taliban. When the Taliban was in power between 1996 and 2001, women's rights to education and employment were brutally violated. They could only go out in public if accompanied by a male relative, and even then had to be fully covered with a burqa. There was severe punishment for disobeying these strict rules. In the 20 years since the Taliban was ousted, Afghan women have fought for their own rights and have taken a proactive role in the development of human rights in their nations, including the establishment of Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. Under the government that has just been toppled, there was a Ministry of Women's Affairs, and in 2009, a landmark law was passed to address violence against women. Afghanistan has also become a signatory to several international human rights instruments, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Now that the Taliban has once again taken over, women fear the worst. Here are some individual stories. Before the Taliban uprising in Afghanistan, life for a gay man, Abdul, his name has been changed, was already dangerous. If he'd spoken about his sexuality to the wrong person then, Abdul could have been arrested and taken to court for his sexuality under Afghan laws. But since the Taliban seized control of major cities in Afghanistan last week, Abdul tells Radio 1 Newsbeat that his sexuality being revealed now would have him killed on the spot. Under the Taliban's interpretation of Sharia law, homosexuality is strictly prohibited and punishable by death. The last time they were in power in Afghanistan, 21-year-old Abdul hadn't been born. I've heard my parents and elders talk about the Taliban, he says. I've watched some movies, but now it's like being inside a movie. By Wednesday, Niloufar Ayubi knew her name was on the Taliban's list. She had learned the news from a friend, the same friend who on Sunday had told her that the Taliban were going door to door across neighborhoods trying to find women like her, the same friend who now warned her that it was time to go into hiding. The women on the list were journalists, politicians, pilots, business entrepreneurs. What they had in common was that they had been speaking about the rights of Afghan women loudly and persistently, online and in real life, for years. Ayubi is one of thousands of women who have built thriving, prosperous lives for themselves in Afghanistan over the past 2 decades. But with the fall of Kabul, their success and outspokenness have come to haunt them. Though the United States had long insisted that the rights of Afghan women would be a cornerstone of any peace deal with the Taliban, that promise now lies in tatters. In Kabul, university students should be getting ready for the start of a new term. Instead, many are destroying evidence of their previous lives as the Taliban patrol the streets outside. For one student, a woman, and a member of the persecuted Hazara minority, which in recent years has faced abductions and killings at the hands of the Taliban, the men outside pose even more risk. Here she tells the BBC how the dreams she hoped to fulfill have been replaced by fears for her future survival in just a matter of days. It's something that I can't put into words, honestly. Everything that I dreamed of, everything that I ever worked for, my dignity, my pride, even my existence as a girl, my life, they are all in danger. Who knows how long it would take them to come and search house by house and take girls, probably rape them. I may have to kill myself when they come to my home. I've been talking to my friends. This is what all of us are planning to do. Death is better than being taken by them. We are all scared, and we are scared to our bones. The Taliban recently massacred and brutally tortured several members of the Hazara minority, says human rights group Amnesty International. Witnesses have given harrowing accounts of the killings, which took place in early July in Ghazni province. Since taking over the Afghan capital on Sunday, the Taliban have tried to portray a more restrained image. But Amnesty said the incident was a horrifying indicator of Taliban rule. The Hazara community is Afghanistan's third largest ethnic group. They mainly practice Shia Islam and have faced long-term discrimination and persecution in predominantly Sunni Afghanistan and Pakistan. ABC News obtained audio recordings from English-speaking Afghans, including Afghan Air Force pilots, translators, and teachers still trapped inside Afghanistan. They're pleading to get out and looking to the United States for help. Several Afghans had worked with the US military, saying they would be killed if the Taliban found them. They said they felt abandoned by the Americans. Why have the American soldiers forgotten about us after everything we did, the sacrifices we did? Why are they leaving us behind? Said Abdul, who worked as an interpreter for the US military. I don't want to be killed by the Taliban. They are going to cut our heads off if they find my location. Please help. The Taliban is trying to find us and are searching for us, said Khalil, who had worked with special US forces. They told me that anywhere I should go, they will find me and kill me. I ask the Americans, please help us. In a shocking and horrific incident, Afghanistan's famous comedian, Nazar Mohammed, famously known as Kashar Zwan, was brutally killed by two men. A video of the horrific incident has now been doing the rounds on social media. Though the incident occurred last week, Taliban spokesman Zabihullah Mujahid today acknowledged that the two men were Taliban. Meanwhile, in Russia, the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses is well documented. Here's the latest example given to us courtesy of Atheist Republic.
On July 29th, 3 Jehovah's Witnesses were sentenced to 6 years in prison in Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia. They were charged with organizing schemes related to extremism. 2 of them are a father and a son, Villain, age 68, and Arson, age 37, Avanasov. Arson Avanasov received an additional charge for collecting donations to pay for a room that serves as their makeshift church. Arson was charged with, quote-unquote, financing extremist activities. Both international and Russian-based human rights watchdogs, including religious organizations, are appalled by the Russian government's actions. The former ambassador of the UK to Russia, Sir Andrew Wood, describes Russia's extremist labels as, quote, having no credible definition.
In India, in yet another instance of hate speech, a video has surfaced where a supporter of BJP leader Yogi Adityanath delivers a speech saying that Hindus should dig up dead bodies of Muslim women and rape them. In a high-pitched vitriol, the unnamed supporter also holds forth statements like Muslims' voting rights must be taken away and how this is important for the creation of Hindu Rashtra. Getting offended on behalf of religion, presuming responsibility as a spokesperson of a religion, making derogatory statements and being outraged for the wrong reasons appears to be taking India by storm. The Vatican has sanctioned a retired Polish Archbishop for covering up child sexual abuse. The Archdiocese in Wrocław said Saturday, the latest in a series of such sanctions in the devout country. The case against Marian Golubiewski, 83, is just the latest sexual abuse scandal to hit the Catholic Church in the predominantly Catholic EU member state. In the wake of formal notifications, the Holy See carried out proceedings regarding Archbishop Marian Golubiewski's reported negligence in cases of sexual abuse of minors by certain priests, the Archdiocese said. The negligence took place while Golubiewski was Bishop of Koszalin-Kolobrzeg in 1996 to 2004, as well as when he was the Archbishop of Wrocław in 2004 to 13. Following its investigation, the Vatican decided to ban Golubiewski from public services and ordered him to donate to a Catholic foundation for the protection of minors. This week's deeper dive is from our correspondent Jason Sylvester on the history of Roman Catholic homosexuality and hypocrisy.
This edition of the Catholic Report goes beyond the weekly headlines and takes a detailed look at a series of complex and interlocking issues currently relevant to a situation in Italy. There are two elements at play here: the history of the diplomatic relationship between Italy and the Vatican's continued hostility to homosexuality. These two issues are relevant because of an anti-discrimination bill before the Italian government and the Vatican's opposition and foreign interference into this domestic Italian legislation. Let's start with a brief summary of the history which led to the creation of the Italian nation and Vatican statehood. In 756, Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, defeated the Lombards, another Germanic tribe that had overrun and controlled much of the Italian peninsula since the late 500s. The so-called donation of Pepin was the gift to the Vatican of a large chunk of land in the central peninsula. Known as the Papal States, the Vatican had direct rule of this territory, which it governed poorly. Think of the worst theocracies today, for just over 1,000 years. That little green blob in southeastern France is Avignon, where several popes resided during the 1300s. By the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, democratic revolutions across Europe were sweeping many of the old autocratic monarchies away, and of particular importance was the French Revolution in 1789. By the mid to late 19th century, where monarchies remained, several were now constitutional monarchies with severely limited powers. The odd man out was the Papal States, a relic of the Middle Ages that was increasingly out of date. Several failed democratic uprisings in Italy occurred throughout the 1800s, but the three events that are significant for their long-lasting impacts were the 1848 revolt and short-lived 1849 republic, the unification of Italy from 1859 to 61, and the Lateran Accords of 1929, which created the Vatican State. The full details of each of these three events are covered in these books by Professor David Kurtzer, the last which won Kurtzer the Pulitzer Prize in 2015. In 1846, Pope Pius IX was elected, following a particularly unpopular and reactionary pope who refused any modern advancements, such as railroads in the Papal States. Pius moved quickly to grant some limited measures of reforms, such as the creation of a council of citizen advisors and a de facto prime minister. However, each new freedom only led to calls for more, something Pius was not prepared to concede. Recall the Papal States was an autocratic theocracy that governed for 1,000 years by, in the minds of the priests, divine right. Secular democracy with rights for the people was simply not part of God's plan. Clerical rule was not only dictatorial, but it was also notoriously corrupt and incompetent. And in the 19th century socio-political climate, freedom and democracy was the new kid in town, and many Italians were not having any more of the hated priests in charge. By November 1848, increasing violence against clerical rule by Italian secularists drove the Pope from Rome into exile in the Kingdom of Naples, after the gruesome and public assassination of the Vatican's puppet secular prime minister. The earlier failed democratic revolts had been put down by the Catholic Austrian emperors, and fearing the Austrians would simply reinstall the Pope in Rome, the secular French decided to intervene to try and protect the limited rights Pius had granted in his first 2 years. In a bafflingly counterintuitive move against their secular principles, the French retook Rome from the first democratically elected Italian government, which had declared a republic in 1849. Failing to win any concessions at all from Pius, who had grown increasingly stubborn and hardened by his exile against any reforms at all, the French threw in the towel and the Pope returned to Rome to reinstitute the despised rule of the priests. The French, however, stayed to act as a secular buffer. By 1859, the King of Sardinia, ironically based in Turin in northwestern Italy, hey, I said this was complex history, had driven out the Austrians, and a groundswell of public support fell in behind the Savoy dynasty to take the Papal States, which it effectively did by 1861, except Rome, where the French were still there protecting the independence of the papacy from other retrograde influences that sought to roll back the clock even further. In 1869, Pius called the First Vatican Council, and, in a massive overcompensation of spiritual dominance at having lost all his temporal power, formulated the doctrine of papal infallibility, which was confirmed at the Council on July 18, 1870. In response to this declaration, on July 27th, the French withdrew their troops, and on September 20th, the Italian state took the city of Rome. In a show of good faith to the international community, the Italian government undertook the Law of Guarantees, which preserved much of the Vatican's independence and freedom. Initially, the Italian government offered the Church more than just Vatican City, suggesting they take the entire right bank of the Tiber, known as the Leonine City. Continuing to be obstinate and demanding the return of the Middle Ages and control of the Papal States, the Vatican refused. The Law of Guarantees was a misguided nod to the history and tradition of Vatican power in Italy, which no other religion enjoys, that was widely condemned by secularists. The guarantees of non-interference ultimately became one of the guiding principles of the Lateran Treaty of 1929, which Mussolini and Pius XI signed, that granted the Vatican sovereign statehood in return for Catholic support of fascism. One authoritarian bedfellow scratches the back of another. It was a match made in hell as the Pope sold what was left of the Vatican's tattered soul to the devil they believe in. Which brings us to today, where the Italian government and the Vatican have locked horns over Italian anti-discrimination legislation for LGBTQ rights, which the Catholic Church claims violates the Lateran Treaty, guaranteeing the Italian people's freedom of religion, or rather, in this case, the freedom of Catholics to discriminate based on bigoted Christian teachings. Known as the Zan Bill, after prominent gay rights politician Alessandro Zan, the Church is overstepping the non-interference boundary by weighing into this national debate, arguing that Italian Catholics' rights to discriminate are being suppressed in violation of the Lateran Treaty. As this new humanist headline wonders, now we know why the Church retains so much power in Italy. And this brings us to the second element I mentioned at the start, Catholic opposition to homosexuality. While it is generally well known that the Catholic Church opposes homosexuality, what is lesser known and remarkably counterintuitive, on the surface, is that the Vatican hierarchy is made up almost entirely, one estimate puts it at 80%, of homosexuals. French journalist Frédéric Martel thoroughly documented this fact in his astounding 2019 book, In the Closet of the Vatican: Power, Homosexuality, Hypocrisy. Martel confirms what I have suspected for a few years, that from the beginning of the Christian Church, homosexuals and asexuals have, one, sought out the Church as a refuge from nosy neighbors demanding conformity to sexual norms, where they could live a life of celibacy without pressure to procreate, or two, to live in a private community away from those same nosy neighbors, where homosexuals could frolic away behind the cloister doors. This has indeed been the case, one that is well documented across the centuries. The counterintuitive part comes from the fact that if, as Martel contends, the Church is primarily made up of homosexuals, why are they so against publicly endorsing the lifestyle? This is where the hypocrisy part of Martel's subtitle enters the equation. Given that all these senior clerics came of age in the era before the sexual revolution of the 1960s, many of them deliberately sought out this protection of the Church where, racked by guilt for their inclinations, they could live in an atmosphere that preached celibacy to fight these evil tendencies. Their whole identity is wrapped up in denial, conditioned by the pre-60s mentality to repress and submerge their identity. The culture war raging inside the Vatican is essentially between the old guard, closeted and repressed, and the open and tolerant homosexuals who are daring to speak out in the post-60s liberation of sexuality and identity. Essentially, the differences between these two camps boils down to that famous line from the movie Fight Club. The first rule of the gay club is you never talk about the gay club that is the Vatican, from top to bottom. As I said at the start, this battle in Italy is complex with an interconnected set of issues that spans centuries of historical context and doctrinal obstinance, and given the many recent cultural battles the Church has lost, for example contraception, they are set to lose this one too. As the old, closeted, reactionary, self-hating homophobes die off, maybe, hopefully, the Church will enter its long delayed appointment with enlightenment.
Thank you, Jason, for that very thorough examination. On the same subject, a retired vicar who was jailed for sexually abusing children was allowed to work in churches for 25 years. David Beater was jailed for more than 4 years on Monday for assaulting 2 boys in the 1980s. The BBC found that he was able to continue to work in churches until 2010, despite this previous conviction in 1985 for abusing a 14-year-old boy in Kent. The Church of England said the case raises concerning questions. David Beater was sentenced at Maidstone Crown Court after pleading guilty to 2 offences against 2 boys aged 8 and 13 between 1982 and 1985. His Honour Judge Philip Statman told Beater he was guilty of a profound and grave breach of trust, adding that it was noteworthy that some of the offences took place within the vicarage. And another one. After 5 years of beatings, sadistic beatings in a garden shed by one of the UK's most prominent barristers, John Smythe, QC, and with a special beating to mark his imminent 21st birthday, Andy Morse tried to take his own life. The student had endured thousands of lashes on his naked buttocks, administered in the name of Jesus by John Smythe, QC. He could no longer endure the pain, terror, and humiliation. Fortunately, his housemates broke down the bathroom door and called an ambulance. But Morse was not Smythe's only victim. There are more than 100 known survivors, and perhaps many others, public schoolboys who took part in a network of military-style Christian holiday camps in the 1970s and 80s. A new book, Bleeding for Jesus, tells the story of Smythe, the moral crusader who fought legal battles for Christian values in Britain's courts while allegedly mercilessly abusing young men at his Hampshire home, and the Iwerne Trust, which organised the bash camps that were his hunting ground and which turned a blind eye to his activities. Back to our lead item, Afghanistan. Alice Bromage was at home on Saturday night when she got the message. She had just arrived back from a work trip when it flashed up on WhatsApp. "I'm stuck here. Please help me get out." The message was from an Afghan man who knew Alice from her days as a major in the British Army, where she served 2 tours of Afghanistan. She trained him and looked after him when he visited the UK. "If we had a weekend off, we would go shopping for presents for his children," says Alice. "He would show me videos of his daughters and what they liked, so that I could help him buy gifts to take home for them. They were very proud of their families." She replied to him and asked for more details. "We're in a very hard time," he said. "He has the paperwork needed to get out, but no money. I have money in bank, but banks are locked now. I was even trying to find milk for my baby and couldn't. Alice says she's not alone in receiving pleas for help. In fact, most of the veterans she knows have. See this from BBC Radio 4's Woman's Hour.
Most of the voices we've heard from the British military have been male, certainly in the reports I've been reading and listening and watching. But how is it in the last 10 days or so, having served there, to look at our role and how do you feel?
It's heart-rending. I joined the army at 17. Like I say, my entire adult life has been given to protecting those that can't protect themselves. And you feel like your time away is absolutely worthwhile, and I wouldn't swap that for the world. But to see it disintegrate and then to get those text messages on your phone of please help me, please help me. This isn't a Star Wars movie where it's coming through R2-D2. This is real. It's coming onto your own phone at night. Here are the passport details of my family. Please help. On the human level, you're seeing families being torn apart. We are, as military, a political tool. We all appreciate that. But that doesn't stop us being human, where we create those human relationships where when someone says, please help, you want to do so. And it's very painful when you can only do so much.
What do you reply? What can you reply?
The first thing I did when I received all those details was say, see what I can do. And I then rang into someone who I know has been helping with the military effort for the evacuation and said, what do I do? So the female military, both serving and ex, has a network called the Sandhurst Sisterhood, which is 2,500 female officers. And that has just been alive with how to help. For example, there's another veteran ex-military lady who's running a security company in Kabul. She's doing what she can. There are funding pages to try and make sure that we can raise funds to actually be able to pay for the security staff to help get other people out.
What a wonderful effort. My guest on Free Thought Hour this week is Matthew Taylor, who has a very interesting story to tell. He was raised in the Plymouth Brethren by his missionary parents in Zambia and is now an atheist in Britain. This is a live Q&A show, so stay tuned on this channel and ask us some questions. It will be starting in a few minutes. We will be back with our weekly news review on all our platforms at the same time next week. Please like, subscribe, share, comment, set the notifications, etc. Thank you for watching.